How many people can say that they've been involved with the following? That they were in the hotel room moments after David and Victoria Beckham got engaged, have been the Director of Communications in 10 Downing Street, and have also been in prison. Welcome to Jimmy's Jobs of the Future. My guest today is Andy Coulson. Andy Coulson has had one of the most varied and impressive careers that you can ever come across. He started off writing about celebrities in the Sun's Bizarre column before becoming editor of the News of the World. He also became David Cameron's Chief of Communications in opposition before moving to him across to government. But Andy's career has not always been straightforward. In 2014, he was sentenced to time in prison over the phone hacking scandal. He's since rebuilt a career in communications. Andy, welcome to Jimmy's Jobs of the Future.
Great to be here. Good to see you, Jimmy.
So I was thinking about the first time we met, and I was a fresh-faced graduate, wet behind the ears in 2010, working as probably what could be best described on the Tory general election campaign as a runner. And it was the night of the first TV debates in Granada Studios. And Liz Sugg gave me the very clear directions of you need to go and get Andy Coulson, George Osborne and Oliver Dowden from the green room. And you need to make sure that they don't get attacked by the 8-foot fox that somebody is dressed out of outside. And you need to do this, and you cannot enter into a debate with them. You just need to tell them to do it, what you say. And I honestly, as daunting tasks go for a fresh-faced grad, that struck me. So I was wondering, because it was obviously quite a momentous night in British politics, because it was the first ever televised debate. And I'd love to know what was said in that green room just beforehand as you were leaving David Cameron to his final thoughts. But then also, how do you think those televised debates have changed British politics?
It's funny to hear you remind me of the fox. I'm also immediately reminded of the fact that we had people in giant chicken suits throughout that election as well, that we had to kind of navigate our way around. It was a big night. It was an important night. It came after a tremendous amount of work, actually, and preparation, obviously not just for the debate, in terms of, how David would handle himself in this kind of new environment. But also getting the debates done was a process of very long, very painful negotiation. And there were very mixed views about it within the team. You'll probably remember this, Jimmy, but and there still are mixed views, by the way. But the debates, or the introduction of TV debates, actually is one of the things I'm proudest of in the time that I worked in politics, because I had the first conversation with, it was actually Sky who led the process. I sat down with Sky TV many months before that, and they said, look, we feel it's time for TV debates to be introduced in this country. And my instinctive reaction, perhaps because I'm a journalist by trade, I kind of agreed, right? I felt that you're right. It is time. The arguments against TV debates just don't feel authentic anymore. And I took that thought back to David, and to his great credit, he agreed. But we wanted to make sure it was done well and that it was done fairly. And so what followed was a long process of negotiation with ourselves, with the Lib Dem team, the two Lib Dem negotiators, of course, I ended up working with in Downing Street, a bit further down the road, and with our sort of Labour oppos as well. And it was a bizarre experience, but we ended up actually getting it in the right place. But there was a lot of internal concern, not just about whether or not, we would be able to, David would be able to kind of tell the right story in those debates. It's a very peculiar environment, right? A TV debate for a politician. But also there was a concern that it would just gift Nick Clegg in particular a platform that he wouldn't have otherwise. That we were elevating up, the Lib Dems to a position that was, advantageous for them and not for us. And of course, after the first debate, you'll remember that was exactly the narrative, right? Because it was perceived that Nick Clegg had somehow won. And then there was that extraordinary period, not a very long period, but an extraordinary few days. I remember I might have this slightly wrong, but I remember an Evening Standard front page where they'd run some polling after the first debate that suggested that Nick Clegg was as popular as Winston Churchill. Right?
Yeah, I think I remember that.
And if I'm honest, that did cause me to think, oh my God, what have I done? But actually, my core belief about it was, I thought David did pretty well. There were some teething problems, in truth, not looking down the camera enough, some technical stuff that didn't work quite well enough. We allowed Nick to sort of, get very personal with the audience in a way that David didn't do immediately, which is now, de rigueur for anyone doing a TV debate. Oh, thanks, John, for that question. We didn't perhaps do enough of that at the start, and also what I perhaps didn't give enough thought to was, of course, Nick Clegg was going to be the more interesting story, right? Because of course he was from a journalistic point of view. But by the second debate, or before the second debate, in truth, I was absolutely convinced that this was going to work out well for us, because I wasn't focused on the Lib Dem so much. I felt that would fade away, and it did. What I was focused on was the fact that the TV debate totally disabled Labour's campaign. Right, because Labour's campaign was focused on the economy, do the old school Gordon Brown proven playbook, press conferences in the morning, scare the living daylights out of everyone on the economy, dominate the agenda through the day, and never let the Tories kind of get out of their box, if you like. Just keep them in that position through fairly old school means. And the TV debates blew that apart. And of course, people were able to judge Gordon against David as well. And we won the debates ultimately. Across the three, we absolutely emerged as winners just in that environment. But I think it also gave us a platform for people to get to know David better. Right, I really do. And I'm delighted that they're here to stay. There was a period, I think, when Theresa was Prime Minister where it looked like we were going backwards on them again, which I thought was a terrible mistake. They should be part of the British political landscape, and I'm delighted that they are, and I'm delighted to have played a very, very small part in the early days of it.
What do you think the other unintended consequences of it were? I mean, from my junior aspect, I remember it sort of the amount of time that had to be dedicated to prep. So normally in an election campaign, you've got the candidate out at maybe like 4 or 5 stops a day around the country. Well, of course, with that taking place, that on the day and the day before, like loads of time was taken out for preparation time. Were there any other unintended consequences that you thought about in hindsight?
No, the time thing was huge, but I think we kind of there's a lot of prep time, right? There was an awful lot of preparation time, and the travelling time. Obviously, the debates, were quite rightly spread across the country, and it did, although I think net positive in terms of what it did to Labour's campaign in the way that I just described. It definitely limited our campaign as well, right? Because the narrative, the story, the kind of, the arc, if you like, of the campaign narrative from a journalistic point of view, the debates were the staging posts, right? So everything was either leading up to or coming off the back of. And so that made it quite difficult for all of us to be able to then create those little moments in a campaign where you hope to kind of dictate the agenda on a particular theme. And that made it more difficult. We had to rethink all that. But as I say, I definitely land on net positive because even though it's a combative, slightly inauthentic environment in a TV studio, you kind of see some truth there as well. You really do see some truth. And that, I think, is just, gold dust in an election campaign. Connection, right? Connection.
Totally. And to go to the start of your career from that, you began at the Basildon Echo. What was your first byline?
My first byline was a check presentation, as it would be for anyone who ever worked on a local newspaper. Can
you remember what the check presentation was for?
It was a local scout. I do remember though that it was David Amos, who was the MP for Basildon at the time, and obviously tragically. Tragic the way that his life ended. He was the first politician I ever spoke to. certainly the first politician I ever interviewed, and could not have been, I have to tell you, could not have been more charming, engaging, and helpful. Right. So I'm a cub reporter on his local paper. I am about as far down the ladder, certainly from a media perspective, that David Amos would ever have existed, and he could not have been more encouraging. And I met him quite a few times subsequently, because he went on obviously to become an MP in Southend, which is also covered by the Echo. To me personally, could not have been more helpful. But no, the early days of the Echo were, I was a general news reporter, so I did a bit of local politics. Sat in more council meetings than's healthy for any individual, district and county. But then quite quickly, I became quite focused on showbiz and entertainment. That was actually my specialism, and that's what I was. I had a column on the local paper that was a showbiz column, and that sort of helped me get up onto the Sun.
And so, what was your sort of big break to get there? How did that come about?
Well, I was back in those days. You had to do your indentures, so you were an apprentice effectively. So I went off for 6 months to be trained down in Hastings, and then you come back and then you do your apprenticeship. And as soon as I got my qualification, my indentures as they were called, that was it for me. I was very, very clear that I wanted to get to London. And so I managed to get myself a couple of shifts on the Mirror, actually, to start with in Holborn. And then through a friend who was already shifting on the Sun, I was able to find out that they were looking for some temporary help on the Bazaar column, which was then being edited by Gary Bushell. And I did a few shifts and did a half decent job, and then that led to a short-term contract, and then that led to a staff job. By the time I was 21.
And what was it? I guess there's two parts to this question. When did you first think you wanted to be a journalist, and when did you first think showbiz is kind of where I really want to go for my first kind of big job?
Yeah, I was actually going to join the Air Force. That was the plan. My dad was in the Air Force, and my older brother was in the Air Force, and I was an air cadet, and I wanted to be I wanted to be the first commissioned officer. My family was my plan, and I was well on track. Actually, I was well down the road towards doing that. And then, as often happens in life, I met a girl, and her mum, who was an amazing lady, was the editor's secretary on the Evening Echo. And she said, "Well, look, why don't you come in and do? I think it's Easter." She said, "Why don't you come in and have a look at the paper and do a few shifts?" And it's life is these little sliding door moments, isn't it? And I just utterly fell in love with it almost on day one. So the Echo was a local paper with the editorial floor on the first floor, and then underneath it were the printing presses, right? So it was still typewriters. I'm that old, Jimmy. So you'd write up your David Amos press check presentation. The paper would be ripped out of the typewriter. It would be taken over to a sub, and if he'd do his marks on it, or you'd be told to go off and do it again, which was probably the case actually. And there'd be 2 carbon copies, and then that would go off to a typesetter or to a proper sub, and from the sub it would go to a typesetter, and then you're down, and then I was, taken downstairs, these rickety staircase, and there's this what seemed an enormous printing press, and then the thing starts up and humming and running, and the whole building's shaking, and then a newspaper comes out at the end of it with your name on it. I mean, what's not to like? And then there's the smell of the place as well, right? It's got a newspaper printing hall has got a particular smell that I just totally fell in love with. And that was it, really. I just decided, right, this is it. So I was still at school. I was 16 at that stage. I wanted to join immediately. As soon as I finished my O-levels, they wouldn't let me. They forced me to do my A-levels. Which I did. University was never a consideration for me. And as soon as I was 18, they called me back in and kept their word for 2 years and said, right, here's your job.
Amazing.
It was fantastic. As for the showbiz bit, that was much later, actually. I've always had an interest. I used to read the Bazaar column as a kid, right? My family were Sun readers. So the Bazaar column, which was then edited by John Blake, has always been a bit of part of my life, and I enjoyed it as a reader. I took that thought when I became a journalist in the Echo and created my own little, frankly, rather ridiculous version of Bazaar on the Evening Echo called Straight Up. What? And so I was already a showbiz columnist when I went to work at the Sun, and so it just became the kind of area that I was interested in, and it was full of fascinating people. Entertainment, obviously, right, is full of fascinating people, but not just the people on in the front of the curtains, the people behind the curtain that I found fascinating. Right, the publicists, the agents, the kind of the lawyers, even, right, and the people that are pulling all the strings behind the scenes, I found fascinating, and the sort of deal making that sat behind show business, I found fascinating. And this was at a time, I'm very lucky, that this was at a time when all that was exploding, right? The kind of commercialization. I mean, showbiz has always been commercialized, but the sort of the turning of show business into, or the accent on the business bit was absolutely exploding in my time as a journalist. Like Planet Hollywood. I don't know if you remember Planet Hollywood. Now, dim in people's memories, but at the time, here you had a restaurant chain, a business, right, a commercial enterprise that was fueled on PR, purely on PR. The burgers were all right, but they weren't that great. It was all about the PR. Sylvester Stallone, Arnold Schwarzenegger, the really big names in Hollywood were shareholders in this restaurant chain. And so when Planet Hollywood in London opened, it was huge news, front page news. That had never happened before, where showbiz had suddenly moved into a different part of the news agenda. And for a tabloid paper like The Sun, it was, that was absolutely the place where you wanted to be. It was fascinating.
I'm always really struck by the business in show business, right? Like it's got it literally in the name. Can you talk to us about a kind of particular deal that you talked about deal making there? Can you let us in on a particularly memorable deal that you struck, perhaps when you were editor or something like that?
Well, Planet Hollywood deals were regular. There were a number of them, right? Every time they opened a restaurant, there was a deal to be done around those. So I did a lot of those and did a lot of traveling as a result. You'd be flown out, first class to Miami to interview these celebrities purely so that the branding of Planet Hollywood would land well, in the Sun. They wanted that, and that was a deal to be done. But I was also there for the sort of rise of the Beckhams, Victoria and David. I knew her pretty well. I knew him a bit as well. Both very sharp, commercial, from the get-go individuals, knew what they were doing, understood the power of brand, understood what the Sun could do for them. And when they got engaged, as peculiar as it sounds, I got a call from their publicist, who I knew very well, to say, look, this is going to happen. They are going to get engaged at this hotel. They'd like you to come along and break the story, right? You'll get the exclusive interview. You'll get the picture of the ring. And then they'll go outside and do a photo call for the rest of the media. So it's a bit of an odd thing to be invited to someone's engagement, but that's exactly what happened. And of course, that wasn't for free. Yeah, that wasn't for free, because this was around the time, which people might remember, there's the explosion of Hello magazine and OK magazine, where celebrities were, actively going out and starting an auction and pocketing very large sums of money for sharing particular moments in their life. In this case, the engagement. And that's exactly what we did. I went up with my photographer, or with our photographer, Dave Hogan, great bloke. Did so many trips and so many jobs with Dave, and we went into their hotel suite, and they announced their engagement to us, Jimmy.
The first person you call, Andy Coulson. How does the negotiation for something like that, to focus on the business side of that, like how does it? Do you sit down with the editor and think, right, well, this is going to be our top line? Because that must have been the story of the easiest story of the year, probably only sub to the wedding, I imagine. Like, how does that
Yeah,
sort
no,
of
it was
process work?
huge. It was huge. It was a splash, and it was 4 pages inside. I think it was very significant, and it wasn't just significant in newspapers, by the way. It was all over the TV as well.
Mm.
Well, the deal is pretty straightforward. I had a very good relationship with the publicist, a guy called Alan Edwards, who's still top of his game now. And Alan said, "Look, this is a possibility. This is what they want." I can't remember now, so long ago, what the numbers were, but pretty chunky, I would have thought. Newspapers were paying a fair amount of money for that kind of access back then, far more than they pay now. Of course, the whole thing has changed now. It's driven by technology largely. The business of showbiz journalism is transformed now. But yeah, I would have gone into the editor and said, "Look, I think this is what it's going to cost, but I think it's worth it." He'd listen and he'd say yes or no. On this occasion, he said yes, and off we went.
Amazing. And how do you think social media has changed it? Because I was thinking that now you would spend time sort of prepping the social media post, and all of that would be the sort of kind of way that it would be done. Celebrity show business news is a completely different beast now.
Yeah, the power has shifted.
Yeah,
the power has completely shifted. Obviously, the internet was the first staging post of that. Where celebrities started to realise that they could build and develop their own brand online. Interestingly, there was a period just on the Beckhams. After I left the Sun. I was I ended up being the number 3 on the Sun. I left the Sun to then go and work for Rupert Murdoch on all his website business, the sort of first sort of .com boom. And one of the projects that I was working on was to go into business with Victoria Beckham. Right, was to build her commercial website. She, at that stage, wanted it to be around, it wasn't around high fashion, it was around, she wanted to be the sort of Martha Stewart, minus the criminal conviction. She wanted to be the Martha Stewart of Britain, right? She wanted the homeware, kids wear, she wanted to do the whole kit and caboodle under the Victoria Beckham brand. And we were going to go into business with her. I was going to build that business with her. And that would be, in partnership with News, my employer. We developed the plan. She was up for it. Got quite a way down the road, and the business decided, actually, we're not going to do that. We don't want you to do that, Andy. Go and be the deputy editor of the News of the World. Another sliding door moment for me. But no, more generally on the shift, internet first staging post, but then the birth of social media transformed it and totally put the power into the celebrities' hands. And that's where we are now, right? I mean, if you've got to be a showbiz journalist now on a national newspaper is I hesitate to say that you're redundant, but it's a totally different job now, because that's not where the power is. They don't need you in the same way as they perhaps felt that they used to. There is no deal to be done, really. I'm sure that's not true entirely. I'm sure that there are. The Sun still, for as an example, still carries some weight, and you'd want to be there. But frankly, as compared to the kind of Instagram following that you could build, the way that you can utilize social media now is far more impactful and direct. It's all about control, right? And that gives you total control and gives you the ability to commercialize it directly.
Exactly. No, well, I want to come on to the future of media more broadly as well, not just the showbiz side towards the end. But one of the things that you now do is that you run a podcast called Crisis What Crisis, which interviews people on when they've had crisis moments. You, of course, had one of the big personal crises that almost anyone can go through, which is being sent to prison. And certainly somebody that from your background is not very common to happen. What were your thoughts when you were sent to prison? It just must be the most shocking, debilitating moment of your life.
Yes, it was not a good day. The first thing I'd say, just sort of, and this is related to to the pod, is that the thing that the pod has given me more than anything else, and I had it already, right? And this, because it's one of the things that I would lean on very heavily throughout the sort of 5 years of my dramas. But the pod has reinforced it, and that's the importance of perspective, right? You just said there, perfectly reasonably, because I think a lot of people would say the same. That going to prison is one of the worst things that can happen to you. It's not. right? It's not, is the first thing, right? I would not recommend it. It is absolutely something that I wish hadn't happened, not just for me, but also for other people that are impacted by it. My family, obviously, most importantly. But it's not the worst thing that can happen to you. All right. It's another place. And this is what I said to myself when I arrived in Belmarsh. I spent 2 months in a high security prison, and then 3 months just under 3 months in an open prison. Very different experiences, I can tell you. What I said to myself the first time that door closed on the cell in Belmarsh was, this is just another place, right? It's not a place I want to be in. It's not a pleasant place, but it's just another place. So let's just, get through it day by day. Understand, this is another lesson that's been reinforced regularly on the pod. Understand what you've got control of and what you don't have, and concentrate on the things that you do have control of, which is, perhaps to some a pretty obvious thing to say, but that is a rule that I live my life by. And I certainly did that when I was in prison. But it was, it was a bit, I think, because I'm a journalist, it was a combination of two things, really, prison. It was mind-numbingly dull. It's as unproductive a place as exists anywhere. And that I struggle with, because I've only ever worked. I love work. It's very important to me. Being productive is very important to me. It's quite aside from the practical advantages of it. It is meaningful without getting too airy-fairy, Chewy. It's where I get a lot of meaning. And not being able to work is very difficult. I find very difficult. And I'd not been able to work, by the way, for years by that stage. The process that I found myself in, because it was so public and so, kind of multifaceted, it rendered me unemployable for, a fair old chunk. And bear in mind, I'm in my early 40s at this stage. And those should be very, very productive years, right? I should have been absolutely firing on all cylinders at that stage of my life. And then suddenly you're, very much on the outside and not able to kind of, move your life forward. In fact, my life was going backwards pretty rapidly. I found that very difficult. But I focused on it. I have to say the main reason is my family, my wife, Eloise, and my sons were just unbelievably supportive and got me through. That was the first and foremost. But also, I fixed on the long term. I never at any point thought, well, you're never going to be able to work again, Andy. I knew that I would. I just didn't know when.
It's a really good point you say about, it's like there are far worse things that happen. And actually, if you listen to your podcast and you listen to some of the crises that people go through, like, you realize just how tough life can be for people at various points. But in terms of the career and work, as you touch on there must have been a bit of you thinking, is anyone going to employ me again? Is anyone going to, how did you think about rebuilding that side of it? I mean, you've done a very good interview on your own podcast where you've been interviewed, and you talk a lot about the sort of family and the personal side. So if people want to listen to that, they can. But to stick on the work side, how did you, sort of approach that?
Well, I hope this doesn't come off the wrong way, because, the backdrop to this, of course, is also a tremendous amount of mistakes made professionally, right? And whenever I talk about, particularly when I talk about the news of the world, I will always start with an apology, because the mistakes I made, although I don't, believe that I broke the law, that was my position in court, it's my position now, I certainly made a shed load of mistakes. I was in charge, right? And it very clearly went very badly wrong. So, that's the first and in a way the most important thing to say. But like I say, I hope this doesn't come off in the wrong way. I never lost sight of, and again, I hope this doesn't get poetic either or too philosophical, but I never lost sight of who I am. Right? And I knew that although I'd made mistakes, some of them very significant, that I was not the person that I was being portrayed as, that the sort of, the story that was played out over a number of years, the things that were being said, what I'm seeing said about myself in newspapers and on television, not without irony, given the jobs that I've done previously, right? Not without irony. So this is not a complaint. I just knew that wasn't me, right? And I knew that, this process was not going to result in a lobotomy, right? I was not going to have my brain removed or fundamentally altered in some way, and that I would therefore not be able to be capable of the kind of things that I've done during the course of my career, the good, right, as well as the mistakes, and I knew that I would be able to deliver some value, right, that I could be of use. I never lost sight of that. I always thought I'd have something to offer. And that's what I focused on. Even in prison, I focused on that. So in Belmarsh, it was impossible to work because the system was broken when I was in prison. We were between governors, and it was utterly dysfunctional. Just, spent most of the day, locked behind a door, utterly useless process. But when I got to open prison, I got a job. They put me to work. I was an education orderly, and I was running Dragon's Den sessions with inmates who were about to leave prison after serving very long sentences. I was doing I was helping people write CVs. I was doing mock job interviews. And I'm not going to try and claim that it was the most rewarding job I've ever had in my life, but I'll tell you what, it wasn't far off. It was really, really interesting, because it caused me to have a lot of conversations with people who'd gone through very, very long sentences, and who are now trying to answer that exact question, Jimmy, that you've just asked me. They're trying to find that answer themselves. How do I find purpose in life? Will I ever be of use again? And in practical terms, will I ever be able to kind of, take part again?
And for a lot of people, and I see the difference, that are in prison, they may never have, had that sense of worth even before going to prison. And how, what did you do? So you were helping write CVs, and, because often one of the things that gets pointed out by people that are in prison is they can be quite entrepreneurial in terms of the way they approach things. Not always legal, but it's a very interesting space in terms of that. How did you help people on that journey of rehabilitation when it came to work?
The entrepreneurial, the use of the word entrepreneurial is absolutely spot on, right? So never mind when I got to open prison. When I was in Belmarsh, at that time, there were a tremendous number of young, mostly black men who were serving sentences longer than they've been alive, right? and some of them for obviously extremely serious crimes. And there was and it still exists as a sort of criminal definition now, but joint enterprise, which is put simply being at the scene of a crime and therefore being deemed culpable, right? So there was a tremendous kind of trend of those convictions in the time that I was in prison. And I got talking to one of those lads as we were walking around the prison yard, anti-clockwise, which interestingly happens in every prison yard
Why
in the
is
world.
that?
I have no idea. Never got a straight answer. Curious though, isn't it? And he was a drug dealer. He was sort of early 20s. And Jimmy, he was whip smart, right? Whip smart, eloquent, and able to. And I got him talking about his business as a drug dealer. And he was speaking like an entrepreneur, Jimmy, right? His grasp of the numbers, his grasp of the importance of kind of marketing, the importance of, he actually used the word brand, in the context of the clearly menacing, frankly, violent kind of image that he had to portray. And I suspect it wasn't just an image, right? He followed through on his brand was authentic, if I can put it that way, yeah? But he talked about it with a business perspective. These are the things that obviously it was also loaded with. I had to do it. I had no choice. I was looking after my family. And the thing in prison is you don't ask those questions because you you let people talk, right? I'm not there to judge. So how accurate and what the truth is, who knows? What is undeniably true is that he was a drug dealer and that he was now serving a very long sentence in prison. And he, it caused me to think that prison is obviously sort of full of those young men who have this kind of entrepreneurial spirit that has obviously just gone off in the wrong direction. And then when I'm at
the wrong sliding door moments, as it were,
the wrong sliding door moment, right? And by the way, we can't just. It's too easy to say, poor them. Although I think in some circumstances that should be the start of the conversation, but you can't say that because people, you got to stand by your own behaviour. You got to stand by your own judgments, right? And that's, that's a sort of slightly separate issue. But when I get to open prison, I'm then talking to older men who, at the end of those kind of sentences, who are now thinking about their future. And you know what? They've still got the entrepreneurial eye. They are still, when I'm doing those Dragon's Den presentations, they are still thinking about themselves through that kind of, entrepreneurial lens. And if we can capture that, there are very, very good people, devoted, dedicated people in the prison system who are focused on doing this. I'm not sure that they're necessarily supported enough right now, or frankly ever have been. There should be more of that in my view. But there's something to harness there. Right? Work is everything, in my view, in terms of when we're looking at criminal justice. Work is everything. You've got to give people purpose. You've got to keep them connected with their families, which I think is also critical. And you've got to provide belief and purpose from an employment perspective. And the truth is, those people that were leaving Hoseley Bay, which is the open prison that I was in, I had a chat with one of the senior prison officers about exactly this, and he said the problem is, he said, we do all this work here, he said, and we have no contact with them thereafter. He said the only time we ever find out what happens next is when it goes wrong and we see them again back in prison. We never find out the success stories. We never hear about what worked and what didn't work. And that's bonkers, right? Because if you look at it from a business point of view, understanding what works and what doesn't work is a fundamental part of the process. We don't have that in the prison system. We never know.
It's really interesting. Yeah, it's not like going back to your old school and giving a speech, is it, I suppose? Were there any sort of Dragon's Den stories, pictures that really stick out in your mind from that period?
Well, there were a fair number that were focused on, I suppose what you might call sort of, unsurprising themes. So there were a number of kind of, potential gym openings. Mm-hmm. One guy wanted to start a private security company, but there were also a couple of retail ideas. One of the prisoners wanted to try and start a bookshop and had a specific idea around that, which was quite interesting. But they were all, I was concerned that they would engage with it. If I'm honest, I thought they might just sort of play at it. It's a box that they're going to tick because you have to do the course to be able to get out, right? So I was concerned that it was just going to be, a bit tick boxy and a waste of time. It wasn't at all. They were really engaged in it. They got excited by it.
I remember one of the bits in Jeffrey Archer's book about people approaching him to help write letters home and things like that. Did you get prisoners kind of approaching you about, wanting help with that kind of thing? Was that something that took place on a pretty regular basis? I imagine so.
In the prison context, you mean?
Yeah.
Help while they were there. Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, no, but the CV writing in particular. And also this kind of, which is a difficult thing. It was easy for me because there was no option for me to come out of prison and pretend or somehow create a professional position for myself that somehow pretended that what happened hadn't happened, because it was so public, and I wouldn't do that anyway. It did happen, and I'm a fundamental believer in accepting your truth, and I have. It is what it is. But there were a lot of lads who didn't want to do that. There were some lads who wanted to change their name. Did I think that was a good idea? There were some people who wanted to, because this is a complicated area still in employment. There are lots of good people out there taking people on with criminal convictions. And this whole issue of whether or not you should declare your conviction, is obviously, as you know, is a subject that's still pretty complicated for ex-offenders. My view was always, which was unpopular with some of the people that I spoke to, you got to accept who you are and accept what's happened and get on with it. Because my view is, as sitting on the other side of that as an employer, I think that's more attractive than having someone on your books for 6 months and then discovering later that they've got something in their past. But that is a personal view. There are very good reasons why that might not be right for other people, and I always caveated it as I'd caveat it now. I think it's a very personal decision.
And your interview with James Timpson, who of Timpsons, is one of the many excellent interviews on Crises What Crises, who's done phenomenal work in it. Has what you've now built a successful business as well as podcast, has what you look for in people changed as a result of being in prison in terms of the skills and the attitude that people have?
That's a great question. Do you know, I think it has. I think because of my own experience, because of the business that we are, we're strategic advisors to business leaders. I like people with a story. I like experience. I like bumps in the road. I like people who know what the difficult looks like and who've lived it and experienced it. And you might say, well, you wouldn't you? Because of what happened to me. But, I like that change in me. And I like that we do that as a business. Because I'm a passionate believer that your failures are as valuable as your successes. That's what it is to be, again, we're slipping off to philosophy here, Jimmy, if we're not careful. But that is what it is to be human, right? Is to learn from your mistakes and develop and evolve and change. And I'm a very, very different person, fundamentally the same person, but I'm also professionally a very different person at 55 than I was, when I was, standing in Victoria Beckham's bedroom listening to her announce her engagement, right? I've changed a tremendous amount during that period of time. And I love all that experience. I think it's, that's what I look for in people that I now work with. And, I'm able to do that with the team that the brilliant team that I'm lucky enough to kind of work with on a sort of permanent basis, if you like, the employed team at Coulson Partners. But we also have this model that allows us to work with people as consultants who come in according to the project, and all of those people have got, rich and I think really useful experience to deploy.
If you could go back to that, hotel room in Victoria Beckham's suite, what advice would you give a younger Andy now?
Also a good question. Look, I think it's a good question, but and this is not a dodge because I will answer it. But I think it's a very dangerous thing to try and live your life through the rear view mirror, right? I think it's because I could absolutely say to my 25-year-old self, get out of newspapers. You're going or perhaps you're going to have an opportunity in 5 years' time, which I did, to leave newspapers with a brilliant idea and go and raise some money and start a business that would have been an early version of TMZ, which was my plan, right? And then instead I was...
What's TMZ for those?
It's a celebrity sort of a website. It was it was an idea along those lines. I could very easily say to my 25-year-old self, that's what's going to happen. That's what you must do. Because, of course, that would have avoided the whole News of the World drama and everything that came after. But that's a hopeless way to live your life and a pointless way to live your life. Yes, I had a terrible time for 5 years of my life. I would not recommend it. I wish it hadn't happened. It was painful and difficult. But I'm a better person for it. And I'm very clear on that. And I'm very clear that I'm a happier person as a result. So who knows, right? If I go back my 25-year-old self, send him off in that direction, who knows where that would have taken me? Or indeed, if things hadn't happened in the way that they did, at the News of the World. Where would that have happened? I probably would have ended up back on the Sun, which is the paper where I was, where I spent most of my career, paper where I really wanted to be. Who knows? Maybe I would have ended up editor of the Sun. What would that have done to me? Who would I have been after as a result of that? Who knows, right? Certainly no guarantee that I would be either as clear-sighted or as happy as I am now. That's for sure. Now I'm going to answer your question. I think what I would say to myself at that age is just remember that every day is an integrity test, because it is. And just remember who you are, remember what your values are. Don't lose sight of those values, and be your own man. I think is the core of it.
And what advice would you give for younger journalists starting out now that are trying to make their way in it? It's changed dramatically. What advice would you give to a 18-year-old person looking to make it in the modern era?
Well, I still think it's an amazing place to be, journalism. Very different now, very different landscape. And of course, the route through is so different now. In some ways, much more difficult. In other ways, much easier, because you have access to platforms now. In a way, if you've got a great idea, you can get out and have a stab at building it. Podcasting is an amazing medium to do exactly that. So in some ways, it's much more exciting and more open than it's ever been. But it's also commercially challenging, right? I mean, particularly if you want to follow the newspaper route right now. Newspaper sales were falling, but were still very high during my time. They've obviously, that's changed pretty dramatically. They're much more resilient than people give them credit for. Even when I was in newspapers, people were predicting that the number of national newspapers in this country would squeeze and would fall pretty dramatically. That hasn't happened, right? They're very resilient kind of products. And I think there's amazing quality in some of our newspapers here. Thank God for them. I think the Times, in particular, is my favourite newspaper. Is to read and to use is just a fantastic product across a whole bunch of different platforms. But I think in terms of where would I now? Would I encourage people to go into journalism? Yes. If they have a proper interest in people, that's the key to it. You've got to be fascinated by people. In whatever area you want to focus on. And I would, I think, I've got 3 sons, right? None of them have shown an interest in journalism yet, possibly because they saw what happened to me. I don't know. They're equally don't have much of an interest in getting involved in politics, possibly for the same reason. I don't know. But I were one of them to say to me, I fancy journalism. Would I direct them towards a newspaper? I think I still would, or a newspaper company. I think I still would, because I think it provides. You just get so much incoming, right? It's such your muscle memory is so better exercised in that kind of environment, in my view. It's a bit like politics, right? That's the joy of politics, particularly on the advisor side, is that you just got so much of it. Yeah. It's an incredible kind of laboratory. And I think my old profession, I think, is still provides that.
And look, we're going to have to get you back on a second time to talk about the future of the media more broadly, because we wanted to do all that in the future of podcasting, and we've run out of time. But the one thing that I really did want to ask you about is, like, one of the things that I think can help people with sliding door moments is the sources of information that people read, right? And it's like one of the reasons when we had Rishi Sunak on the podcast, I asked him, like, what does, as he was then Chancellor of the Exchequer, what do you read? And he gave, a list as long as your arm of all these economy blogs and so on. But I think to myself, if people can hear those things and someone's an aspiring economist or whatever, and then use those, that is the job of this podcast. You talked about reading the Times. What sources of information do you use now to kind of stay abreast of everything?
Yeah, well, obviously I'm a podcast fan, so I listen to your podcast, Jimmy, obviously. No, I love podcasting because I think it's the reasonableness of it, right? That's why I love it. It is a place where you can have, as we are now, having a conversation. I don't feel like I'm being interviewed, right? It's not combative. It's not it's not agenda driven. It's a reasonable environment. I know that there are podcasts that perhaps take a slightly different approach. I understand that, but the podcasts that I love are where you feel like you're in a conversation, and there are so many great podcasts that can give you that, and at the same time provide you with some expertise. If you were interested in how finance works, right? You go listen to the Money Maze podcast, which is just a brilliant environment for not just actually interesting conversations with very influential people. You'll learn a lot. So I try and do as much of that as I possibly can, because I'm still learning. That's the old cliche, every day's a school day. I totally agree with that. I'm absolutely still on receive. But in terms of more sort of traditional media, your taste changes as your life changes and as your job requirements change. So obviously I need to be on top of business. I need to have a good grip on what's happening politically. We don't do public affairs work per se, but I love to give a view on politics, and that obviously requires a fair amount of reading. That's become really interesting. So Politico didn't exist in my day.
Yeah.
I think it's brilliant, right? What a brilliant digest, brilliantly written, brilliantly pitched, really useful, right? Really useful from a practical perspective. So if politics is your thing, you've got to engage.
Do you think
that kind of content?
Do you think Politico is more influential than the Today program now in setting the agenda?
That's a good question. Do you know what? I don't know enough about its numbers to be able to give you an answer that's sort of scientifically proven. But my instinct would be yes. My instinct would be yes, because because the genius of Politico is it sets you up for the day. Right, it sets you up for the day, and that is one of the kind of purposes of the Today program. But it does it more efficiently than radio can obviously possibly do. I find it really, if usefulness is one of the kind of, as I say, purposes of the Today program, then Politico I'd say is more useful to me. But that's not the only purpose of the Today program. The Today program at its best when Nick Robinson, is able to, and I'm a fan of Nick's. He's got an astonishing resilience story. He was on the podcast actually. I don't know if you know Nick's story, but if you don't, go and please have a listen, because it's worth listening to. He had a terrible trauma in his much younger days that he came through. I think he's a terrific journalist, and when Nick is asking the right questions, it's deeply, deeply valuable. That truth bit that we talked about right at the beginning with the TV debates, a great journalist will get to that, with just the correctly phrased question. And occasionally, by the way, the right silence. The power of silence
on radio,
in radio is so understated, and Nick is the master of it.
Totally. That's a brilliant finish, Andy. Thanks so much for coming on. It's amazing to take in all your wisdom of what's changed over the years and to hear more about your story and what you're up to now. So thanks so much for coming on.